Everyone assumed the British and French were genetically distinct nations, separated by sea, language, and a millennium of war. But when scientists sequenced their DNA, they found the opposite. Bloodlines so entangled, the rivalry itself becomes fiction. For nearly 1,000 years, the English Channel has been treated as more than just a body of water. It has been a border between identities. Two peoples, two languages, two opposing visions of Europe entirely. It begins in the year 1066 at Hastings, when William the Conqueror crushes Anglo-Saxon King Harold. From that moment, England and France lock into a rivalry that defines the entire medieval European world. Agincourt, Crécy, the 100 Years' War, Waterloo, Trafalgar. Every generation produced a new battlefield, a new monument. Every conflict gave both nations another reason to insist they were nothing alike, biologically and culturally separate. The Channel became a symbol, a genetic moat dividing Anglo-Saxon, Viking-tinged English from Latin, Gallic, Frankish French. Two entirely distinct bloodlines, two distinct heritages. That is the assumption every school child quietly inherits as truth. And it is precisely the assumption that modern genetics was finally, definitively able to put to the test. National identity is a story, DNA is a record. And the record does not care about flags or treaties. It simply preserves what happened. Every migration, every conquest, every quiet century of intermarriage along the European coasts. For decades, geneticists suspected the story did not match the science, but they lacked the resolution to prove it. That changed when two massive European population genetics projects collided, overturning 1,000 years of cultural certainty. But DNA does not respect national borders, and what scientists found refused to fit the inherited maps of Europe. The first major dataset came from a landmark study called the People of the British Isles Project. Researchers at Oxford spent more than a decade collecting samples across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. They were not interested in modern city dwellers. They wanted ancestral signal, so they imposed a strict rule. Every donor had to have 4 grandparents born within a small radius of the same rural location. That rule is critical, filtering out the genetic noise of the industrial age and modern urban migration. It captures the DNA of populations rooted in the same soil for centuries before mass migration scrambled them up. More than 2,000 individuals were fully sequenced, their genomes mapped across 3 independent layers of human ancestry. Their autosomal markers, the Y-chromosome lineages, passed father to son, and the mitochondrial DNA inherited from mother to child. 3 layers of ancestry, 3 independent records of the past, analyzed in parallel for the first time. On the other side of the channel, researchers turned to French samples from the Human Genome Diversity Project and the CEPH biobank in Paris, panels drawing from Normandy, Brittany, the Loire, Provence and Alsace. These panels are the genetic equivalent of a national archive, the deep ancestral memory of every French region. When scientists laid the British and French datasets side by side, they expected a clear genetic boundary, a clean edge corresponding to the coastline, 2 clusters, 2 distinct peoples. What they got was something else. The first cluster map already broke the hypothesis, and the data only got stranger from that point. To understand why, examine the layers of history buried inside European DNA across thousands of years of migration. Because no population is a single thing. Every modern nation is a stack of migrations layered over centuries. The British and French stacks overlap far more than centuries of military rivalry between the nations suggest. Start with the Celtic substrate. Before Rome, before Anglo-Saxons, before Vikings, Celtic-speaking peoples occupied a vast arc. It stretched from Central Europe across Gaul into the British Isles, a single broad cultural and genetic family. The Gauls of modern France and the Britons of modern England were not foreign cousins. They were kin. separated only by a narrow strip of water that ancient Celtic traders crossed routinely between the two coasts. Then came Rome. The occupation of Britain lasted roughly 4 centuries. The occupation of Gaul lasted even longer. And yet, in both cases, the genetic footprint of Roman soldiers and administrators turned out to be minimal. Rome ruled, Rome did not reproduce at scale. Local populations absorbed Roman law, Roman roads, Roman language fragments, but not Roman DNA in any meaningful quantity. The empire left culture and architecture, but no significant bloodlines. After Rome collapsed, the migrations began again. In eastern England, Anglo-Saxon settlers arrived from coastal northern Europe. They came from regions of modern Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark, crossing the North Sea in successive waves. Their genetic signature is visible in modern English, DNA, especially across the central and eastern English counties today. It is real, it is measurable, but it is not total. The Anglo-Saxons mixed with Britons, not replacing them. Then came the Vikings. Norse raiders established the Danelaw across northern and eastern England, leaving genetic traces around York. Meanwhile, on the French side, the same Norse populations settled the region that would bear their name, Normandy. Then 1066 arrived and changed the equation. Here is where the genetic rivalry truly begins. When William the Conqueror landed at Pevensey, he brought a Norman aristocracy that would reshape English law for centuries. The new ruling class spoke French. They built castles, redistributed land, imposed a foreign elite on a defeated population. For nearly 1,000 years, historians have assumed the Norman conquest must have flooded English DNA with French ancestry. The Normans ruled, they married into the aristocracy, they dominated every level of society above the peasantry for generations. But this is exactly where the data delivers its first shock, and what scientists found defies every expectation. When scientists measured the Norman genetic contribution to modern English DNA, they found something extraordinary. The signal is small, far smaller than the cultural impact would suggest. The Normans rewrote English government, language, and nobility, not DNA. This is what geneticists call elite replacement without population replacement, domination without genetic conquest, a hidden bloodline truth. A ruling class can dominate centuries, yet leave only a faint genetic trace in those they ruled. The peasants kept farming. The peasants kept marrying their neighbors. The genetic ocean beneath the Norman court remained unchanged. If you dig deeper into what genetic evidence reveals, subscribe. We uncover one hidden bloodline every week. So where did the French signal in English DNA actually come from? The signal is there, unmistakable and large. It doesn't come from where the textbooks say. The answer requires going back much further than 1066, past the Vikings. Past the Romans, past the Celts themselves. The deeper scientists looked, the closer the cousins became. Roughly 4,500 years ago, a population archaeologists called the Bell-Beaker people began spreading across Western Europe. They are named for the distinctive bell-shaped pottery they left behind, but their real legacy is genetic. They carried a powerful ancestry component derived from the steppe peoples of the Pontic-Caspian region, far to the east. The Bell-Beaker migration reshaped the genetic map of Western Europe, moving across Germany, France, and the Low Countries. Then critically, it crossed the Channel. Reaching the British Isles, it did not merely add to the existing population. According to multiple genetic studies, it largely replaced the Neolithic farmers who had built Stonehenge. This is the foundation. This is the bedrock layer of modern British and French DNA. Both carry deep ancestry from this same migration. Both populations carry the same steppe component. Both share, at the most fundamental level, the same prehistoric origin story. Look at the Y-chromosome data and the pattern is undeniable. Haplogroup R1b dominates both sides of the English Channel. It is the most common paternal lineage in England, in northern France, in Brittany, Normandy, Cornwall and Wales. The same haplogroup, the same ancient fathers, the same bloodline branching across a coastline history, later called a border. Brittany and Cornwall, separated by the Channel, share genetic profiles so similar they cluster together more tightly than neighbors. Cornwall groups with Brittany before Eastern England. The sea was never the barrier, the sea was always the highway. But here is where it gets interesting. The ancestry runs deeper when British DNA meets Northern French DNA specifically. Because France itself is not genetically uniform. The data is clear. French regional diversity is larger than most assume. A Breton from the western coast and a Provençal from the Mediterranean shore show measurable genetic distance between them. France absorbed Visigothic, Frankish, Basque, Italian and Iberian influences across its long history. The south leans Mediterranean. The north leans toward the Channel. When British DNA meets these regional French populations, the result is striking. And the British cluster most tightly with the populations of northern France, Normandy, Picardy and the Pas-de-Calais coast. The same coastline that William the Conqueror sailed from. The same coastline that the Normans always called home. Now compare British DNA to other European populations and the picture sharpens further into something genuinely unexpected. The English are genetically closer to the northern French than to many populations within their own islands. Closer to northern French than to certain Irish samples. Closer to northern French than populations in the Scottish Highlands. Closer in some measurements to northern French than to the very Germans the Anglo-Saxons supposedly descended from. Read that again, because it overturns a foundational assumption of English identity hidden in plain sight for centuries. The English are not, at the genetic level, a primarily Germanic people who happen to live near France. They are a channel people, a coastal population entangled with the coastal population on the other side. Two halves of a single ancestral region split by water. One final dataset delivered the shocking answer. When researchers ran formal admixture analysis on southern English populations, the proportion of shared French ancestry stopped them cold. Southern English populations share up to 40% of their ancestry with northern French populations. 40%. Not a trace. Not a marginal signal buried under statistical noise, but a massive, dominant, structural genetic component. A core part of Southern English DNA is, in genetic terms, indistinguishable from the DNA of northern France. The two populations are not cousins, they are something closer to siblings raised in separate households across the Channel. Siblings who never realized, across 1,000 years of warfare and rivalry, that they shared the same parents. Consider what this number truly means. Southern England's genetic distance to northern France is smaller than to parts of Scotland. Smaller even than the distance to rural Wales. The Channel is a narrower genetic boundary than Britain's own internal divides. 1,000 years of rivalry, war, propaganda and national mythology. And underneath, the DNA told a different story entirely. English and French along the Channel were never two biological peoples. One ancestral population quietly pretending to be two. The rivalry was political theater. The biology was unity. The final genetic verdict on a millennium of feuding. The wars were real. Cultural differences real. Languages, cuisines, institutions, all distinct, shaped by centuries of separate development. But the bloodlines beneath those institutions were never separate. They were braided together long before the first Norman ship crossed. What this means for your ancestry test is bigger than history. You've seen percentages labeled British, English, French, Northwestern European. You've already encountered this puzzle without realizing it. Those categories blur, they overlap. They borrow from each other constantly. The reason isn't laboratory imprecision, it's biological reality. These populations simply aren't genetically distinct enough to cleanly separate. A person with deep English ancestry will frequently show measurable French components in their modern DNA test results. A person with deep Northern French ancestry will likewise show measurable English or broadly British genetic components. These are not contamination, they are not errors. They reflect a shared ancestral substrate no border could sever. It reframes how we should think about European heritage, identity built for centuries on separate bloodlines and origins. The genetic evidence shows those separations are far thinner than the rivalries between European nations would ever suggest. The further back you trace the lineages, the more the borders dissolve. The deeper science goes, the more interconnected. The British and the French make the clearest case because their rivalry is historically the most famous one. But the same pattern recurs across the continent. The genetic record keeps revealing what the political record hides. Europe is, in deep ancestry, a tightly woven web of overlapping populations who later invented stories of separateness. Those stories were crafted to justify the borders drawn between them. The English Channel was merely a stage, the DNA was the truth behind the curtain. Next, an even older rivalry hides in the same data. The Germans and the French, two nations whose mutual antagonism shaped European history as deeply as Anglo-French feuds, two peoples who, like the British and the French, have been told for centuries they are biologically distinct. The genetic evidence is already in, and the answer it delivers is, if anything, stranger than what you heard. If you want to know how French DNA compares to German DNA, that video is already in production. Subscribe now, and the next genetic comparison will arrive directly in your feed the moment it releases. Because the hidden genetic history of Europe is not a single story, it is a layered archive in blood. It waits in datasets that researchers across the continent are only now beginning to read in full detail. Every rivalry has a bloodline underneath it. Every border has a genetic record that quietly contradicts it. What modern DNA tests really reveal is not who we are separate from, but who we resemble. We are quietly, structurally, ancestrally the same as the neighbors we have spent centuries calling our rivals. For the British and the French, the answer has been hiding in plain sight for 1,000 years. Subscribe now to uncover the next hidden bloodline beneath Europe's borders. One